was not doing the work is VK International. All right? Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I also would like to talk about the same progress. Let's discuss the area of energy. Let's discuss the area of energy. GPL, right now, when we took office, had $1.9 billion in their bank account. That would have taken them to the end of October, they would have zero. This previous government, when they were in office, lent GPL 50 million US dollars to buy 5 generating sets. Each generating set weighs 150 metric tons. It is somewhere in Finland. The other part of that contract was for $994 million for civil works. That will take you 10 months long to get done. Right now, as of this morning, Mr. Speaker, there's a 15% completion on that job. That means that money that was spent there will not be benefiting Guyana or the people of Guyana until April 2021 thereafter. So, Mr. Speaker, the issue with GPL and the blackouts is that the previous government has not invested only $1 million in 5 years, $1 million US dollars in 5 years to put baseload capacity into GPL. That is why you're finding every day there are blackouts everywhere. Everywhere you're finding there is blackout because there is zero revolving capacity at GPL. Every time an engine goes down, people get blackout. Every time a wire is burnt, there is zero revolving capacity at GPL. The $50 million US was added to another 2.3 that GPL had to now take from their empty coffers to put into the project to deal with civil works, further putting that institution into further financial disadvantage. Right now, we had put out an EOI, Mr. Speaker, 40 persons plus responded. So we will have to put immediately private generation capacity into the grid. And that is what we are working at GPL. Mr. Speaker, I would not leave GPL as yet. Upon looking at the books of GPL, I have found that there is $14.1 billion that the government of the past 5 years owes GPL. It seems that there was a national policy unwritten somewhere that you should not pay your light bill. Now, $13.1 billion represents 4% of this entire 2020 budget we're looking at. 4% of your budget is owed by GPL, by government to GPL. So that is leaving. So when we talk about progress, again, looking at GPL, I'm not coming off of GPL until I'm fully exhaust this matter, and the nation knows. Over the past 3 years, GPL has racked up $8.7 billion in losses. 8.7 billion with a B in losses over the past 3 years. And I will leave GPL to rest as I move to the other area. Let's look at, Mr. Speaker, let's look at the Guyana Civil Aviation Authority. That authority have a mandate that is very, very crucial to the aviation sector. That organization had in its books $1.17 billion 3 years ago. The previous government spent out $800 million in 3 years. When we got into office, what we found is that the management of the Civil Aviation Authority came to the ministry and said, we need subvention of $41 million just to maintain a 4-month reserve to maintain the ICAO certification. That the asset base of that institution with its cash has been depleted with record speed, 188% depletion in reserves. I will leave GCCA and move to transport and harbors. Mr. Speaker, upon checking transport and harbors, at the end of July 2020, they had $2.5 million in a loss in their books. They did not have money in the bank account. It was zero. It was zero. When we looked for why it was zero, we found that Transport and Harbors have in its books $945 million in debt. $945 million in debt. Who they owe this money to? This money is owed to, Mr. Speaker. $461 million is owed to Guyana Revenue Authority. That is monies that were deducted from the staff to be remitted to the authority and could not have been remitted to the authority. The second one, Mr. Speaker, is $323 million to NIS. That is monies that were deducted from employees to be remitted on the employees' behalf to NIS and has not been because the institution just could not afford it. $57 million was owed to other small vendors and another 104 to some small contractors and so on. $945 million in the red. They had owed people when we took office. I want to make sure that is on the record of the National Assembly. Mr. Speaker, let's look at the Hinterland Electrification Company Incorporated. For those who have never heard of this before, let me enlighten you. This company is a holding company for 7 other companies that provide electricity to the hinterland regions, including Linden. Linden has 4,597 consumers. Mr. Speaker, this, my understanding, supposed to be one of the strongest bases for the opposition. What you found is neglect. Right now, Linden is in the hole of $726 million, that company. It was underfunded under the APNU government. Mr. Speaker, I continue to say that only Friday, I had to make supplication to the cabinet, myself and Minister Edghill and the Prime Minister, to provide $89 million to Kwakwani. Kwakwani have 1,089 consumers there for electricity. Kwakwani did not have money to pay the workers. They did not have money to buy fuel to run the generators. It was total neglect for this agency that provide, Mr. Speaker, this particular company provides electricity at least to 15% of Guyanese population that resides in the hinterland. 15%, and it was totally neglected. In totality, with the rest of them, that includes Letem Power Company, Mahdia Power Company, Port Kaichuma, Mabaruma, Matthews Power and Light, with the totality of debt that these companies racked up by providing electricity to our citizens in that area, went up to $981 million. That is in the red. That we now have to find monies in this budget to try to fund it. Mr. Speaker, there was an issue at Matthews Ridge that the Honorable Juan Edghill dealt with immediately on day one. We got a call that they had blackout for like 8 weeks because of a 147 kVA watt generator was not serviced in time because of a single part. A single part. So I go back, when we talk about progress under the APNU, do you categorize that as promise? And my answer, hell no. Mr. Speaker, I would like to also touch on the matter that the Honorable Fatman raised about this budget have nothing new, and that the ratings of the country went up under their management. Ratings is one. But Guyana is lived through the villages. The villages where I come from, the humblest of villages, the country lives through its villages. And at the village level, there is mass job losses. There is depletion of the basic necessities to operate and live. The hospitals, somebody talking about hospitals earlier. The hospitals do not have drugs in them. When we check the records of the Ministry of Health, since 2018, we are seeing procurement of drugs. 2017, late 2017, the procurement of drugs. There's no records to show us otherwise, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when you go to the other villages in the country, the infrastructure is next to nothing. Look, the other day, we had to rush down the road by Diamond. We had to rush down the road by Diamond. We went to Diamond, where a coca broke, and flood the entire area. They never had that before. We went there, it broke through because there was no maintenance of a simple coker. And that is something that you see repeated all over the place. Mr. Speaker, I would like to talk about the progress again. Let's look at NISIL. Mr. Speaker, NISIL, and this one here, I must apprise the National Assembly. NISIL has a $30 billion bond that they raised for Gaisuku. One of the areas that the APNU was put 7,000 people out of work. They raised $30 billion to try to help Gaisuku. As of only May month, no one could able, NISIL itself could not able to pay back the installment on the loan. They had to take money from the $30 billion to pay back the loan. How can you borrow money to do a purpose and then you're taking that same money to pay back the loan? It defies the reason why you're borrowing the money in the first place. NISIL also, Mr. Speaker, has vested 23 transactions of land in Ogle, All Sport, and Larry Souvenir on the east coast of Demerara. 9 have been vested, with only 2 fully paid up. How can we vest land, transfer ownership, and nobody paid a cent on it? How is that possible in this day and age, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, land leased to Peters Hall too. There are 181.84 acres of land at Peters Hall that have been leased to 20 companies. Those 20 companies, Mr. Speaker, it did not go out to public tender. The rest of people could not have an opportunity to bid on it. It was secretly done, and it was vested to these 20 companies. Worst of it, it was not even prepared. The legal documentation was not even prepared by NISIL people, NISIL legal team. It was some other legal team attached purportedly by NISIL. Mr. Speaker, these are some of the small things that we see when we assume office. But let me go back to the issue of the budget and the size of this budget of $329.5 billion. Mr. Speaker, what we have seen over the past 5 years, and I've recently had to respond to an article by the former finance minister, Mr. Jordan, that says that the budget is private sector and it does not address people. So that speaks exactly to the collective misguided philosophy of the previous government. Misguided philosophical differences between the PPPC. We believe that private sector is the engine of growth. The private sector creates jobs for our brothers and sisters throughout the country. You have to make sure that you don't strangulate them. That is what happened in the previous government. It was a strangulation of taxation that caused a lot of them to shut up. And it is reflected in the numbers, Mr. Speaker. I have a lot of people here. And it's reflected in the numbers, Mr. Speaker. This document is volume 1 of the estimates that is presented by the Honorable One Edghill, emanated from the Ministry of Finance. In 2014, its revenue intake by the PPP administration the last year was $145 billion only. Look at this one here, 2019 year end, $226 billion raked in with taxation. Where did the extra $91 billion come from? It comes from the pockets of the poor Guyanese. The economic philosophy of the previous government was tantamount. The economic philosophy of the previous government was tantamount to a vampire strategy, sucking the blood out of the country, the people. Every single Guyanese become poorer because $91 billion was taken from them and brought into government coffers to furnish and help a lifestyle of squandermania. All to help that. Mr. Speaker, I want to address some of the issues that were raised by the other two speakers before me, and I have to talk about it. CGIA, CGIA, Mr. Speaker. I went there with the Honorable Minister Wanejil again, had to read the Riot Act to a contractor that is over 800 days in liquidated damages. 800 days ago, this project's supposed to be finished, and it's still not finished. We were presented a report, Mr. Speaker, of 914 items that were in defects. 914 items that was not in accordance with the contract. Mr. Speaker, this particular contractor finished Movietown, finished the Pegasus, and still can't finish the taxpayers' airport. Still cannot finish the taxpayers' airport. Mr. Speaker, the records will prove that the previous government, paid 6.7 million US to this China Harvest Company for delayed works that was the result of the contractor and not the government. They paid the people 6.7 million US dollars for delays work that the contractor is responsible for. How is that possible? That I'm paying you for your bad behavior. Mr. Speaker, what is worse here is that the scope of works that was original in the contract did not resemble nothing that we saw down there. There was 23 million US dollars in changes in scope of works. And the scope of work that they changed, I think the young man talked about lipstick on a pig. Well, lipstick on a pig was on the old piece. The honorable member, the old piece was lipstick on a pig. Because if you go there now, you're going to see some Tarzan, some wire slinging in the ceiling. That is what you find there, Mr. Speaker. When you're supposed to get eight bridges, you only have 4 from a company called Vatapel. Vatapel have something called Allen Bradley Systems that manages the PLC system for these air bridges, and they don't work. It don't work. Mr. Speaker, the Cherry Jagan International Airport remains a profitable institution, generating its own revenue. The monies that were spent to build this airport, 150 million total, we must get the value for it. The Honorable Minister, myself, read the Riot Act to that customer, that contractor, and we expect it to get done according to the revised scope of work by the previous government. I would also like to touch on we in the PPP have square pegs in round holes. The comment of the young man, the comment of the honorable member, I would say the honorable member that when you all was in government, 67% of your people was pensioners, come backy and bring backy. 67 of them, bunch of pensioners. So I am saying to you all, you talk about jobs to young people, you look at around this table here. Here, at least I know. I want to talk about the education sector. You said just now, the honorable member said just now about we don't have no plan for the education sector. How can you, in your previous government, take away $10,000 from poor children? How can you do that? How can you do that? Whilst you give away with contracts that you sign billions of dollars to other companies or companies. How can you take away from poor children? It is just not morally right. Right? You talk about discrimination and you talk about going into the budget and seeing that the plans in the budget is only for one set of people. We are a government that manages and for all Guyanese. Everyone. I would like to say this to you. Mr. Speaker, that I went to Canal number 1 and Canal number 2, and you talk about discrimination. Part of the road at the front was fixed, and the one piece at the back remained damaged. You talk about discrimination, Mr. Speaker. That is there for the world to go and see. Mr. Speaker, I move on. The honorable member, I hope I get it right this time, sir. No disrespect intended. The honorable member talk about hamper, hamper, hamper country. I remember with these 2 foot walking this country sharing hampers, but I never see none of y'all over here sharing any hampers. Nobody over here. So it's not about hampers. It's about our brothers and sisters are starving because of the policies that y'all put in, and people need to eat. That is why the president has put $25,000 per household. He has put $25,000 per household, 4.5 $4.5 billion into COVID-19 response to each household. We're going to do better than that. Again, let me come back to the comments made by the honorable members before me. We talk about jobs, and we're not providing jobs in the budget. What is that? You all put 30,000 people out of work. You all are a government of unemployment. You go across the country. You fired 1,972 CSOs. You fired 7,000 sugar workers. What did you do with the mining sector? You taxed the mining sector. Everybody pack up the thing and leave the back dam and come out. We are reversing all of those. The young man, the honorable member again spoke about rice. There's a difference between rice and paddy, right? There's a difference between rice and paddy. Rice is a process. After the process of paddy, it comes into rice. So if you think it's 10,000, if you promise people $10,000 for a bag of paddy, what are you going to go to the shop to pay for a gallon of rice? Think about it. Why are you paying? So listen, the policies that you all put in for the agriculture sector, to tax herbicide, pesticide, and fertilizer, is one that is taxing development. The rice sector is a developmental sector, and that is why the Irfan Ali government is removing all of them. Mr. Speaker, I would like to talk about some of the good things in our budget, because it seems to me that I had to venture off to some of the comments on the other side that I believe warranted a response. But I would like to talk about some of the things that are in the budget with respect to our infrastructure across the country. The first one is that for 5 years, there was a bypass road from...
Honorable member, that's a 3-minute warning for you. You can continue, sir. That's a 3-minute warning for your first 30 minutes.
Could I ask respectfully for a 3-minute extension? Well, 5-minute extension for the speaker on the...
Sorry, I was giving him, honorable member, a 3-minute warning to his 30 minutes.
Oh, sorry about that.
Okay, so I was counting as 27, Mr. Speaker, so you owe me that stop. I got to give me back an extra minute.
30 seconds more.
Mr. Speaker, there was a proposal on the table for a bypass road from Ogle to Hagsbush. That ended up becoming somehow 208 million US proposal, because those who were in government somehow believe that they want to run it till the diamond in the forest phase. What was happening is that the Indian government only had a line of credit for 50 million US. So you have to do target costing. I don't know if it's people never heard of it. This is the cost. You model the project to meet the cost. Day one, President Ali, Vice President Barjagdio, myself and Bishop Edgel looked at it and modeled it cost per kilometer. When we found the point where we meet 50 million, it stops at Hagsbush. We will be putting 4 lanes there from 7.8 kilometers of road. We'll be going there. The Indian government has accepted the redesign, and we will be going forward with this project, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, there was another issue about a ferry that goes to Region 1. This ferry sitting there, the money is there, 8 million plus 10 million, loan and a grant, to give you a ferry so you can alleviate the problems of the trips going up from Perica to Region 1. It took 5 years. So even sit down and look at that and sit down with the Indian government and say, let's renegotiate, let's see how we can get this through. Never was done. Matter of days, it was done under the PPP government. Matter of days. The other matter, Mr. Speaker, that I would like to raise is that the East Coast Road that they said that they finished, it is not finished. It's partly finished. They still got money in the account to spend to get the road finished. I am saying to you, Mr. Speaker, that the PPPC government will finish that road. Some, some, it seems to me that they can't finish the road. The other thing I would like to speak of is the other major high-end infrastructure that we're going to put in the country. The Demerara Harbor Bridge will see soon an expression of interest coming out for a fixed-span bridge, 4-lane fixed-span bridge. We have also started the process of the Linden to Mabura, the first leg of the road. We have already started renegotiating with the financial institution to get that road finished. Nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, we will get it done. We are a government that gets things done. Mr. Speaker,
This is a good time to seek the extension.
How much are you?
Honorable member, this is a good time for one of your colleagues to seek the extension.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask that the honourable member have another 5 minutes to conclude his presentation.
Thank you, honorable member.
Thank you, Madam.
Go ahead, sir.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to speak to the issue of this budget being a poor designed budget. And I would like to put some of the issues that we have raised and put on the table in this budget. The first one is the removal of all of the VAT on equipment for farmers and miners. That single-handedly will leave money in the pockets of farmers and miners. I don't know if some of y'all never been into farming and mining. It's toiling. It is gang to gang, they say in the back dam, 6 in the morning to 6 in the afternoon. Mining, when you work a dollar, it is a hard-earned dollar. When you start a tax, mining and farming, but you're just doing cruelty to people. The current government, the Ali-led government, were already put on the estimates to remove all VAT on ATVs, tractors, you name all farming equipment and mining equipment. All gone. As I said earlier, moving on to some of the other measures, the Ali government is removing VAT on electricity and water. Electricity is something that embraces the entire population. How can you tax something like that? How can you tax something that the child have to put on the light in the night to study? You're taxing the light that the child is studying on. How can you do that? It is anti-development. It is cruel. You're taxing water. Water is the bringer of life. How can you tax water? Well, again, Irfan Ali's government has removed those VAT on tax, on water, and electricity. The other area that I would like to talk about is the poultry sector. All of we like to eat chicken. All of we like to eat chicken, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they accuse us of having a budget for no poor people. When I'm putting the measures before the floor that we put in, they're saying that I'm going through all the sectors. The world is seeing that this budget is a budget to help people. What is in this budget in 1 year gives back to the people that you have taken away for 5 long years. That is what this budget is. Mr. Speaker, the chicken, I'm going back to the chicken. All y'all like eat chicken. Y'all eat chicken earlier. Y'all eating chicken earlier. Y'all punish the poultry sector. Punish the poultry sector. Move everything from 0 rated into standard rated. Everybody got to pay a tax. They got to empty the pocket to pay a tax. That entire industry has given a new life by the Irfan Ali administration. A new life is breathed into it, right? Mr. Speaker, some of the other areas that we have removed taxes from, simple items. When you export your goods, everyone who is a businessman, or some people think they're business people, if you export any goods, your margin is only between 10 to 15%. The minute you trouble with that cost model, you end up putting the export in Guyana at a disadvantage. The previous government, what they did, they made everything exempt. So once you exempt the input into the production item, it means that it's a cost to the project, the product. It wipes out the profit of the exporter and makes it not a profitable venture. That now is gone. The Finale administration removed that. He's put everything as zero rated so that you can reclaim your money, reduce your costs, and you can operate. We can start back the export industry, and we can make sure that we get foreign income from that. Because as you know, Mr. Speaker, the reserves of the Bank of Guyana has been depleting because all of the foreign export owners they got to lash the head. They got to lash the head. The first one was the sugar sector. The second one was the rice sector. The third one was the lumber. They started tax shingles. They tax shingles, which bring me to the construction sector. Mr. Speaker, all of the building materials that they put tax on, Dr. Irfan has removed them. He has removed them, so a poor man could go and build his home now. You could go and buy and repair your little kitchen, and you don't got the tax. Mr. Speaker, before I leave this podium here, whenever you go and eat with your family of four, your wife and your children, you got to pull up a next chair, Mr. Speaker. The tax man sitting there, eating just like you. When the bill comes, look at the bottom, there is tax. They tax everything under the sun, Mr. Speaker. I am saying to you that the Irfan Ali has saw that. Those are hardship measures, and we are removing those things. Estimates are in the budget for itemized tax removal for items of production. Items of production tax, they have tax incentives there. So private sector can operate. They can operate and start making back wealth. That is what this country is about. Everybody got to make money. And we have to facilitate. Government is a facilitator. Everybody has to make money. Mr. Speaker, I would like to say and close by saying that the Irfan Ali's philosophy, economic philosophy, is to drive industry. That is why you will see infrastructure in housing booming. You will see infrastructure in roads, bridges, all of the ports. You will see new hotels going up. That is the infrastructure vision of the Ali administration. And we are here as the executioner to make sure that we get it done. We are a government that gets it done. That is what we are. We will execute that mandate. The mandate is to build Guyana and build Guyana so that we can admire what we build. Not the brown elephant that you see up the road. Not that. That is not something to admire. That is something to cringe at. Ladies and gentlemen, I rest my case.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. We now turn to the Honorable Member, Ms. Coretta MacDonald, for her maiden presentation. Honorable Member, Ms. MacDonald.
Honorable Speaker,
Again, go ahead.
and members of the National Assembly, permit me to extend words of congratulations to the Honorable Speaker on his elections to preside over the proceedings of this Parliament. Mr. Speaker, much confidence has been entrusted in you, and it is my hope that you would execute your duties with the highest degree of pride and dignity, which, on our side, we feel will foster healthy discussions and development. Mr. Speaker, allow me to quote from Mr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I say, I quote, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." Again, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Mr. Speaker, I too am honored to be here to offer representation to the people of this country and as a consequence on this budget. Mr. Speaker, please allow me to say to some of my honorable colleagues on this side of the House, we are here to conduct serious business. And I would urge you and all of us to be accurate in our address to this House and to this nation. The Honorable Minister reported in his presentation about training done by BITS. Mr. Speaker, may I inform the Honorable Minister that as far as, or I should say as close as Region 8, women, men, boys, and girls were trained to operate small and large vehicles, machinery, among cake decoration and sewing and all the others that you can talk about. Honorable Speaker, you see this, when the coalition government stood there, we did our homework. And so coming from the training we executed across this country, they were based on where the skill sets were most needed. The other honorable colleague spoke about the THD. But I wish to say, Mr. Speaker, in 2015, the THD owed $425 million to various companies. Mr. Speaker, the main reason for THD not being profitable is because of the construction of the Berbice Bridge, which denied the THD to being a profitable organization. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, the extra cost for running the Chinese vessel that was not built correctly. Mr. Speaker, after careful consideration and perusal of this budget, one could only conclude that this budget is deemed to be private sector friendly and not a budget offering much hope for the working class and the poor people. Mr. Speaker, for us to be effective, it requires a clear philosophical path. And as such, the authors are advised to begin a process of serious rethinking and directing, of which I'm prepared to offer these submissions. Mr. Speaker, an individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of humanity. Mr. Speaker, the time has come for us to stop calling and just throwing numbers in the air and to address each issue in a cogent and constructive manner. As such, the budget speaks to the creation of 50 jobs, 50 new jobs. Mr. Speaker, 50,000 new jobs, Mr. Speaker. It is overly important, Mr. Speaker, that when we talk about creating 50,000 new jobs, are we saying to this nation exactly where those jobs are going to be allocated? And while we are putting those jobs out, at the same time, we are dismissing hundreds and hundreds of persons. Mr. Speaker, I want to say to you, Mr. Speaker, may I say to us that we can only approach or bring reasonable sense to this whole budget planning and all the jobs that we're talking about creating, if only we would put them structurally in place so that citizens can follow and monitor what is happening. Mr. Speaker, again, while we are creating 50,000 new jobs, and we too embrace offering a solution to one set of workers, the sugar workers, what have we done with the bauxite workers? Mr. Speaker, After 40 days in office, Mr. Speaker, this sitting government, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, would have sent home so many persons not thinking about how they will live tomorrow or how they will get by, whether how their children will get by. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, is that the COVID policy? Is that the policy of a caring government? Mr. Speaker, oil and gas, occupational health and safety. Mr. Speaker, as a nation, we are prepared, or we must be prepared for the challenges that will confront us in the oil and gas sector. However, citizens the world over, statistics would have shown us, have experienced exploitation, marginalization, ethnic conflicts, and most of all, the undermining of our democratic process. Mr. Speaker, we must be prepared to meet these challenges. And it is for this reason this budget is being debated. Mr. Speaker, I say, considerations must be given for allocating of funding to address and strengthen the laws in such areas as occupational health and safety, trade union recognition, and workers' education. As oil and gas continue to be an important part of our development, systems must be put in place so that every group, every region, every NDC, and every single citizen, regardless of your creed, culture, or religion, must benefit equally from this process. It is a fact, Mr. Speaker, this does not only apply to employment, but the contract for supplying of labor, goods, and other services which must be distributed equally across the ethnic group in this country. Mr. Speaker, what I'm speaking about here is starting a process of an affirmative action where no racial or ethnic group would be left behind. Mr. Speaker, this brings me to the point of the continued exploitation of young men and women, primarily in the commercial sectors, spanning across this country. It must be noted, Mr. Speaker, that the minimum wage has become the maximum wage in the private sector. And while employees who earn this wage grovel at the feet of their master's table, the same employers live luxurious lifestyles and they're buying mansions locally and overseas. Mr. Speaker, as the budget consideration is being proved, I call on the Honorable Minister of Labor to put in place the requisite order to make the $60,000 agreed upon by the tripartite committee as the new minimum wage for the private sector employee. Mr. President, Mr. Minister, Mr. Speaker, you cannot control what happens to you, but you can control your attitude towards what happens to you. And in that, you will be mastering change rather than allowing it to master you. Mr. Speaker, the Labor Code Commission. Mr. Speaker, the most recent pieces of legislation came out of intense consultation from amongst the social partners. But we need to recognize that there are rapid changes that are taking place in our society. And as such, it requires a constant examination of all the existing legislation. And it is for this reason consideration must be given not only in making resources available for the day-to-day administration of the Ministry of Labor, but a Labor Code Commission to be established to work with the prime purpose of addressing the legislations and looking at new legislation. This commission can be drawn from human resources representing government, employers, and workers' organizations. This is the change that needs to be considered. Mr.
2
Speaker,
minutes.
regional democratic councils and state boards. Mr. Speaker, the RDCs and state boards are asked to carry out many statutory obligations and to discharge their responsibilities in their respective constituents. Mr. Speaker, in the coalition government when we stood there, not only that it was expected that these meetings were required.
Comrade Speaker, I do ask that we reiterate to this House that the honourable member is making her maiden speech. And as customary, we allow the honourable member to make her presentation without being heckled.
Okay, honorable member will continue. You have still 2 minutes remaining before an extension. Honorable member Ms. MacDonald. Honorable member Ms. MacDonald. Honorable member Ms. MacDonald, you still have 2 minutes to your original time of 15 minutes. Please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, RDCs and state boards. These are asked to carry out statutory obligations and to discharge their responsibilities to their respective constituents. Not only that they are expected to attend meetings, but are required to be informed by way of acquainting themselves with studied positions, which requires research and diligently arriving at positions that will advance the meetings. Mr. Speaker, 90% of these persons are not executive officers. And the time has come, Mr. Speaker, for us to be able to address these persons at arriving at a position to advance their meetings. Mr. Speaker, we need to look at a couple of things, and I would list them. We need to look at the remuneration of these persons. We need to look at how they move from place to place. We need to look at their schedules. And Mr. Speaker, may I say, in order for us to be able to effectively function, we must provide the materials that are so necessary to persons who are expected to carry out their function. Mr. Speaker, we must be these persons must be appropriately quantified, and that they ought to be remunerated for same. Mr. Speaker, this House, and during the life of this Parliament, I urge that consideration be given for regional councillors, and the non-executive directors of state companies and corporations to be considered for incentives and other forms of remuneration in order to carry out their optimum. Debunching and merit increments. Mr. Speaker, the issue of merit increments has been a bugbear in both the public and the private sector. And for this to be corrected we here have to start by setting the example, which is the state. Over the years, the issues of debunching have been recognized for teachers and traditional public servants, but the concomitant action has not been taken to correct the situation. As we seek to address the 2020 budget, Mr. Speaker, which includes its estimate, the government, the Minister of Finance, and the National Assembly must sit and address these matters by appropriating requisite sums to correct the situation. Any failure, Mr. Speaker, in taking action on these issues will once again communicate to all workers across this level that their interest is not being seriously addressed. Mr. Speaker, may I say in conclusion, the time has come for us to stop the fluff. For us to stop the bluff. We are no longer in elections mode. The time has come for serious business. And so, Mr. Speaker, we must now hold hands, put heads together, and lead the way in addressing not only the concerns, but the problems that confronts the working class people and every citizen in this nation. Mr. Speaker, may I remind us that in order for our citizens to be able to enjoy the good life, we must make it our duty to revisit what made us strong, the values, the approaches, and the types of struggles, and the continued articulation and the publication of our proud history. Mr. Speaker, as a people, we have got a job to do. And I would expect, Mr. Speaker, that we would do the job that is so allocated to us in a diligent manner. Mr. Speaker, I would ask that consideration be given by the Minister of Labor for all of those workers, including some of my colleagues here who were sent home, that provisions be made for them. In closing, Mr. Speaker, allow me to remind us that we here are one people, one nation, with one destiny, and together, the opposition, the APNU, AFC, we will rise and we will be on the other side of the house. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Member. Another maiden presentation will come from the Honorable Member, Mr. C. Paul Narain. Honorable Member, Mr. Narain.
Mr. Speaker, it is with great pride and honor that I rise to address for the first time this honorable House. I am humbled as I stand proudly on the shoulders of other trade unionists whose contributions in this august body brought fundamental and significant improvement to our working people. That tradition, I believe, is one that ought to be continued. And that is my advice to the honorable member, my colleague sitting on the other side of the House. Mr. Speaker, my first intervention in this House is indeed special as I speak to the 2020 national budget, which would impact upon the lives of every Guyanese and align our development trust with the needs of our people. Mr. Speaker, much was said by the other honorable members across the House. One has to be reminded, and the teachers must be remembered about this, that it was under the previous PPPC administration government that the teachers' union were able to have agreements after agreements, as compared to the APNU AFC, when teachers stood up rightly for their rights. What were they told? Greedy, selfish. What a shame. I just wish to advise the honorary member that, sometimes we need to remember our friends. And in so doing, as trade unionists, we ought to respect what is right for our members. And when one talks about, better life under the AFC, APNU government, it was $91 billion of additional taxes, which was punishment for the Guyanese people. And that is what one has to fairly look at. We are told that Budget 2020 is private sector friendly, not for the working people. Well, these are people who are speaking without any vision. I don't think they would have listened to Minister Ajel, neither would they have read the budget itself. Maybe they don't understand, that's right. Then we talk about political appointments. And what about bauxite workers and so on? It was the APNU AFC government that caused 30,000 odd people to lose their jobs in this country. Let them say if this is not true. 2017 mid-year, the records show that the unemployment in this country was 13%. Thereafter, a number of sugar workers and others, Barama workers, the dealings with the bauxite people, they left and they're gone, all these jobs. After that, they never published the number again. Shame on them. And then, at that time too, the rate of poverty was 30% of the population. Let them tell us now, under their watch, what are those numbers? Let them say it. Mr. Speaker, one talks about workers' rights and protecting workers. The Guyana Forestry Commission, which had once been a profitable entity, could not have paid salaries for a few months. Bonus of $25,000 awarded in 2018, our honorable minister had to recently bail them out to provide that money so that poor workers could be paid. And then we are talking about the protection of workers and workers' rights. The trade union recognition, it is appalling that you have a trade union recognition board that has not been functioning for many months now. And then the honorable member talks about $60,000 and calls on the minister to make an order. Well, the minister has what is necessary. Two things, which the lady minister couldn't have, and which the former minister maybe didn't have. But our Minister of Labor is going to make that order of $60,000. Where were you since March 2019, when it was unanimously approved that the minimum wage in this country should be $60,000? Where were you? Mr. Speaker, the re-establishment of the Ministry of Labor is a living example of the PPP commitment to respect the working people and have in place a ministry to address their problems at work. Mr. Speaker, we are told again, I want to repeat, that this budget doesn't have anything for the ordinary people. Mr. Speaker, it was indeed refreshing to listen to my colleague, the Honorable Minister, Juan Egel, articulating plan after plan, initiative after initiative, and program after program, all geared at improving the well-being of all Guyanese. Certainly, it was a much welcome and marked departure from the budgets we have had in the last 5 years, when Guyanese feared what next would be increased and what else would be taken away from them. Mr. Speaker, Budget 2020 marks the first step in the journey to reverse the vampire-like policies that plague our nation over the last 5 years, when the coalition spared no one except themselves. Guyanese had to pay all the way from the cradle to the grave. That was the life the coalition condemned the Guyanese people to, while their elites flew here, there, and everywhere and benefited from health care in faraway lands. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, many poor Guyanese faced troubled times to put meals on their table and could not get drugs from the public hospitals and health centers. And many of their gains were sucked away by the coalition government. Mr. Speaker, Budget 2020 is a pro-people, progressive budget with significant attention to lifting our working people, putting them to work, and making them and their families comfortable, while building a better and stronger Guyana for our children. Mr. Speaker, this is a budget of hope for all Guyanese, where we will see our nation's prosperity benefiting all and not a few, as we saw during the coalition government. Mr. Speaker, over 30% of the budget has been allocated towards the health and education sectors. This is equivalent to more than $100 billion being spent in probably the two most critical areas of our country. This is a clear signal of the priorities of the vision of a government that cares for its people. Mr. Speaker, as someone who has been closely associated with the sugar industry for many years, and more so, the struggle of the sugar workers, their families and their communities, the budget was a breath of fresh air. It is no secret, Mr. Speaker, that the coalition purposefully sought to demolish and destroy the sugar industry to their own nefarious ends. This is no other reason. This is no other reasonable explanation for the coalition's attitude to the industry and the tens of thousands who depended on its operation. Sugar production last year was the worst in 80 years. During the life of the coalition, sugar production fell by over 60%. Under the coalition government, which prior to its election said they had all the answers, but certainly they had the wrong answers. You know, before the closure at the head office, they had 395 persons employed. After the closure, Mr. Speaker, they had 505 people despite 4 estates being closed. And they're talking about efficiency, and they're talking about employment and so on of people. It had to be employment purely for their cronies. You know, you had so many other people and production fell. His Excellency President Mohammed Irfan Ali pledged his commitment to reopen the closed sugar estates and to once more breathe life into those communities which the Granger Nagamutu administration turned into ghost towns. Budget 2020, Mr. Speaker, demonstrates that commitment with the allocation of $5 billion for the sugar industry. Mr. Speaker, over 7,000 sugar workers in the midst of a volatile Christmas season were put on the breadline in a most callous, cruel, and heartless act, described as the largest retrenchment exercise in post-independent Guyana. One could never forget, Mr. Speaker, the December 6, 2017 Stabroek News, the front page screaming out, 2,000 workers sent home at Skeldon. And in that same publication, there was a picture of former President David Granger petting elephants in Africa. What a shame. That was how the working people were treated in this country. What sort of government were they? What kind of leader puts thousands out of work without any plan to deal with the fallout? Didn't they have any compassion for those workers and their families? They were least concerned about how these Guyanese citizens would eat, send their children to school, or pay their bills. If that was not spiteful, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, then tell me what it was. Mr. Speaker, that is not all. That is not all. The Honorable Minister of Agriculture, Zulfikar Mustafa, has already put together a team to commence work for the reopening of Skeldon, Rose Hall, and Enmore estates. In fact, the Honorable Minister, accompanied by union officials, including yours truly, along with technical personnel, visited the closed estates for meetings with people. Mr. Speaker, the dark clouds and hopefulness which hovered over the sugar industry over the last 5 years will disappear as the dawn of a new era unfolds under this PPPC government. Mr. Speaker, what we saw on the ground was nothing short of criminal. Billions of dollars in equipment was left to rot in the sun and rain by this APNU AFC when they were in government. I am heartened that this PPPC government have begun the process to have a capable board of directors with a competent management team. The industry has several possibilities to success. Opportunities for electricity production, refined and packaged sugar, alcohol. I hope my comrade over there is listening. And bottled molasses, among other things, assure of a successful and viable future. Over the last 5 years, much was lost, and the sustained efforts to restore the industry's viability was torpedoed by an unsympathetic administration who certainly didn't understand or possibly did not care about sugar's importance, not only to its workers and their families, but to our entire nation and economy. Among their sins was 5 years, no increase in pay to the sugar workers. For 5 years, notwithstanding all state employees receiving increases each year. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I must compliment our team of the PPPC administration, who undoubtedly worked tirelessly to bring this budget in a short period, despite the challenges they confronted. Foremost must have been COVID-19, which, like sugar, was badly bundled by the coalition, is only now being proactively addressed, with billions being channeled to bring relief and to heighten our response. I see too the budget making active efforts to address the infrastructure deficit and the paucity in government services too. These are welcome developments which will redound to all our people. Mr. Speaker, as I said before, this is a budget of hope. It brings Christmas in September. Budget 2020 has something for everyone and is indeed a true plan for prosperity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Honorable Member. I just want to remind the House that we have a number of maiden presentations and we ought to pay our first presenters in the National Assembly the courtesy of some amount of quiet in the Assembly as they make their first presentation to the National Assembly. With this, I call the Honorable Member, Mr. Devin Sears. Honorable Member, you may make your contribution.
Mr. Speaker, as I rise to make this presentation, be it my maiden speech for the 2020 budget, I rise with humility, firstly to the Almighty God for His continued grace and mercy towards me. Secondly, I must express heartfelt thanks to the people of Upper Demerara, Upper Borghese, and citizens of Guyana for their vote of confidence in APNU plus AFC. Consistent prayer and words of encouragement. There are also many people who played a critical role in my life and who I need to say thanks. And as in the words of recording Archie's Coffee, gratitude is a must. To you, Mr. Speaker, I extend my gratitude for your continued professionalism and commitment to the administration of the affairs in this National Assembly. Similarly, I express thanks to my colleagues, members of the winning team, who will be back in government soon. The Leader of the Opposition, Joseph Harmon, for his dedication to service and his commitment to excellence. Mr. Speaker, I crave the indulgence of this Honorable Assembly to also thank my mothers, Joy and Desiree, for their love, guidance, and support. My children, Tehila and Jahim, who continues to be my motivation and encouragement with every hug and smile. My supporting team, Raphael Trotman, Larry London, Katie Sears, and party executives, along with local leaders. And most importantly of all, I want to say thanks to the resilient and powerful people of the constituency I represent, Linden, Region 10. I recommit myself to work for your professional advancement and the development of all communities. It has not been an easy road, but together with your councillors, we have made great strides. With your full participation and your continued support, we will achieve the vision we have set for our homeland, Guyana. Mr. Speaker, as I address this Honorable Assembly, 2 words come to mind: Guyana first. For emphasis, I repeat, Guyana first. Guyana is unique, culturally, ethnically, religiously, and even politically. Spanning over 83,000 square miles, we are temporary inhabitants of the lost city of El Dorado. While here, we must coexist, find strength in unity, while working towards one common prosperity and equality goals. We are Guyanese first. And I quote Mahatma Gandhi, "The earth provides enough to satisfy every man's need, but not every man's greed." On Wednesday, the 9th of September, Member Edghill presented a budget which does not represent the will of the people. A budget that lacks merit, vision, and progressiveness. Mr. Speaker, I am forced to reflect on my colleague Trotman's opening remarks, which highlighted the striking dissimilarities of a government that embraces a good life for all Guyanese, as against a fraudulent government that snuffs the wealth out of our people's pocket. The nation's budget is supposed to point the way forward and show clear and specific terms that priority programs to achieve key developmental milestones. The members on the other side are lucky to have inherited an economy that is growing and flourishing. When the APNU plus AFC took up office in 2015, we quickly brought back democracy to the people of Guyana by reintroducing local government elections. We have lessened the national debt, according to ECLAC 2019 economic survey, by 4 to 1.7% of the country's gross domestic product, the lowest in Latin and Caribbean. Introduced telecommunication and internet access throughout the length and breadth of Guyana. We have embraced alternative energy as outlined by the Green State Development Strategy. And further, President Granger's vision for a decade of development. Mr. Speaker, these are examples of forward planning that is needed. As a country, we are on the brink of great wealth with the emerging oil and gas industry. The members on the other side seems nearsighted. As I consider its implication on the lives of all Guyanese, it became clear that this budget is incomplete, incoherent, and innately not credible. Mr. Speaker, my constituency's feeling towards this budget is despondent. Upper Demerara, Upper Berbice, overall estimated budgetary allocation is 4.2 billion, but still leaves much to be desired, since 53% of that allocation goes straight to employment costs. Once again, like pre-2015, it reveals that the bauxite mining community has been sidelined from real economic development. This budget does not cater for new investments, no new transformational infrastructure work, nor job creations. Mr. Speaker, I met with many healthcare professionals who shared dissatisfaction with the provision of the package that this government has given them. They still work under substandard conditions. They lack personal protective equipment, ventilators, and for a community of over 50,000, only one COVID-19 testing kit. This is unacceptable. I must highlight to this House that medical laboratory technicians are not given risk allowance in my region. I ask this House that we should ensure that our health workers, our frontline workers are well represented in this budgetary provision. Mr. Speaker, I can proudly boast that for the first time in history, under the APNU AFC government, a regional agriculture unit was introduced. I can continue to boast that we have commenced work from the Millie's Hideout Road to Barbeach River, which will allow farmers to transport their produce to the mainland. But I must make recommendation on behalf of my constituency that greater work, given the fact that we have hiking farming in the Barbeach River at Takama Savannah Road, is needed urgently to serve Ibini, Kalkuni, and Lower Barbeach River. As I reviewed the budgetary allocation under Public Works 2020 program for my constituency, it became clearer that this budget, again, does not have any transformational projects. Mr. Speaker, it seems to me that Budget 2020, titled Our Plans for Prosperity, is an atrocity. Better yet, a Lego building block budget, because this budget builds on the legacy of the APNU AFC's vision for a better Guyana. Take, for instance, the Wismar-Mackenzie Bridge. Also, what we spoke about earlier, the the Lethem to Lindem Highway. We also have the Linden-Suzdijk Highway, all of which we have found funding for. Mr. Speaker, I humbly ask that the intellectual authors of this budget review Region 10's plan of action for regional development, which focuses on enhanced environmental, sustainable economic and development. As Guyana develops, history will judge us on how we take care of the elderly and new generations to come. Mr. Speaker, it is disappointing to note that the pensionable increase is a measly and frivolous $4,500. Might I share with this House that it was the intention of the APNU AFC government to increase the pension to the minimum wage, half of the minimum wage, which will take it to $35,000. Mr. Speaker, this regressive budget does not cater enough for youth empowerment and development, very well knowing that over 65% of our population are millennials who are currently at risk. According to the Trading Economics, Guyana unemployment rate as of 2019 was at 11.9%, one of the lowest in history under our administration. But it's my fear, Mr. Speaker, that the unemployment rate has risen, given the fact that a lot of our hard-working young people's contracts have been terminated by this very well administration. Therefore, I have some questions. One of the questions that all of our young people are asking, like my colleagues would have shared, where are the 50,000 jobs that was promised? And I have a specific question to Honorable Hamilton. Those persons who were terminated within the last month or so, some of who is sitting on my side, are you going to make representation for them when it comes to training and accessing more jobs? We need to rescue our youths. There is no subvention for my constituency when it comes to sports association. No visible increase in technical education. No major provision for support in the cultural industry and creative arts industry. So our youths, hold tight. We'll be back in government soon. Mr. Speaker, the public sector workers want to know, again, where is the 50,000 or 50% salary increase that was promised by this administration? They want to know why it was not catered for in this year's budget. Mr. Speaker, regretfully, Russo Bauxite Company workers' contracts were terminated.
And there are talks in the air that they will be resuming soon. What is the government plan to protect the rights of Guyanese who continue to be abused by international investors? The government's budgetary plans during this COVID-19 pandemic with regards to education leaves much to be desired. The idea to use the learning channel along with radio broadcasts when it comes to the curriculum is lethargic and a frivolous facade to show that Guyanese people that you are doing something. Have you thought about persons in various regions who have not been afforded these amenities? I say again, you're building on the legacy of APNU plus AFC, because in every school across this nation have internet access through the Ministry of Telecommunications. And this here is clear that we continue to widen the gap with the 1% wealthy as against those who have none. Mr. Speaker, easy access to transportation is important when it comes to my constituency, given the fact that oil and gas sector is growing and our economy is growing. We will be trading very soon with Brazil. And I believe that an airdrome is needed in Linden. At this point in time, we have 2 airstrips, one of the best in this country, 2 miles asphalt in Linden, and another one in Kokwani, which needs urgent repair. And let me make it lucid that those airstrips, because we've gotten word that someone is trying to privatize it. I speak on behalf of my constituency. The Linden airstrip and Kokwani airstrip is not for sale. Mr. Speaker, permit me to identify the major impediments of our country's development and identify real solutions to those problems, primarily those drafted in this week's budget. As we have seen, Guyana is in a time and a place where it has met its lowest in history when it comes to the healthcare system, where uncertainty is paramount. It is at a time when everyone's pride and dignity of our people has eroded. As a lecturer for over 10 years, I've been trained to identify flaws and critique so that I get the best out of my students. Last week, I observed the government making lousy excuses while submitting an inconclusive and incoherent budget that does not give a prosperous life for all Guyanese. You commend yourselves of saying you had 21 days, but when in fact you've had since 21st of December 2018 to complete your homework. Mr. Speaker, the APNU AFC introduced a 5Bs initiative that the other side has inherited, which works. But as a former lecturer, I give the government 5Ds, of which some you already know. And this here reflects Budget 2020. It is defective, deceptive, divisive, destructive, and deformed.
To conclude,
Mr.
Honorable
Speaker,
Member, you need an extension.
Mr. Speaker,
Honorable
as I
Member?
conclude, I say to you,
Go ahead.
Mr. Speaker, as I conclude, I say to the government, go and do your homework. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Honorable Member. We now have the Honorable Member, Mr. Sanjeev Dattadin, for his maiden presentation. Honorable Member, Mr. Dattadin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon. I rise to make my humble contribution to the 2020 budget debate. Indeed, it is my maiden speech in this House as well. Firstly, as my colleagues have done, I wish to offer my warmest congratulations to Minister Bishop Edgell and the staff of the Ministry of Finance, his staff as well, and indeed the staff of all the other ministers that have put together this budget in record time. It is important that we understand that this budget is required because it's been 640 days since this House has considered a budget for this nation. Now, the honorable member who spoke before me has said that we should do our homework. Now, it would help him when he said that there is a reduced budget and expenditure for Region 10. If he would take a look at Volume 1, page 570, 2018, $3.4 billion. 2019, $3.9 billion. 3.8 billion. 2020, $4.1 billion. Mr. Speaker, this budget is entitled Our Plan for Prosperity. It expressly states that it is, among other things, to strengthen democracy and the rule of law. It's unusual that 50-odd years in a country like ours, it is so crucial and important that we focus on the rule of law again. The rule of law, as we all know, has been around since the time of Aristotle. And that is essentially what guides civilized societies. In its modern incarnation, he's looking at me? All right. Mr. Dicey, the legal philosopher, Mr. Dicey, has the modern incarnation of the rule. And that is that the law must apply to everyone, including the lawmakers, the government, enforcement officials, and those who hold public office. In the last 5 years, Mr. Speaker, the rule of law has been eroded before our eyes. And in the last 5 months, in the 5 months that followed March 2nd, 2020, it was practically murdered on television daily. You didn't win any. Mr. Speaker, it has been 640 days since the government fell in a no-confidence motion. Now, the last time that this House considered a budget was the 14th of December, 2018. Indeed, 160 million, in excess of that, of this present budget, 160, more than 160 billion with a B, of this budget is to pay all of that expenditure that took place from the 1st of January to August 2nd without parliamentary oversight and without any oversight whatsoever. Mr. Speaker, We cannot wait for the period 21st December 2018 until June 18, 2019 for a government and for the leadership of a country to figure out that 33 is the majority of 65. We cannot wait 179 days for leaders to appreciate, understand, and apply the most elementary principles of mathematics. The rule of law was undermined because the coalition, as government of the day, wanted not to respect the Constitution. The CCJ, the Caribbean Court of Justice, had to tell the coalition government that 33 was indeed a majority. It then took another 20 days. It took 20 days from the 18th of June 2020 to the 8th of July 2020 for the APNU AFC coalition to understand that Article 177 of the Constitution was obvious, that votes had to be counted. There was a rule. Valid votes, I'm not sure what else you were thinking of counting. But elections and governments are elected by votes. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member, Mr. Trotman, has said, if I heard him correctly, that no weapon formed against APNU AFC shall prosper. I humbly submit to you, he's wrong. It has been formed already. It's called the Caribbean Court of Justice. And that weapon has stood for the people of Guyana and against the destruction of the rule of law, and it continues to do so. Now, abuse, governmental abuse. Mr. Speaker, since the no confidence motion, which presented a very clear proposition, the government of the day fell. The Constitution is clear. Our leaders are expected to read and understand English. They're expected to also to give effect to the words of the Constitution, not to play games, not to hide behind mathematical fallacies. But since the no confidence motion, there have been 4 cases principally that have engaged the court. There was firstly Reed against Jagdeo. There was Yulita Moore. There was Eslyn David. And there was the Jones case. What was the abuse? All of these litigants had lawyers from across the Caribbean that were paid for by the state of Guyana. How could this be? The rule of law if there is a secret legal fund available to some members of the society and unavailable to the citizens at large, we think that it should be disclosed. I have been in practice for more than 22 years, and I have never heard of the government funding litigation against itself. In fact, you don't need to be a government to figure out that that's ridiculous. Well, the 5 months after March 2nd was characterized by the coalition doing everything within its power to undermine the rule of law. The attempts to rig the elections were transparent. They were even childish. The honorable member who is speaking, the honorable member in the opposition benches who is speaking would know about that. On a daily basis, he would be on television spinning tales. When they were discovered that those tales were false, he would invent more. He would have a good business writing children's stories. Only my humble suggestion, Mr. Speaker. But seriously, Mr. Speaker, no government should be permitted to undermine the will of the people and to use the courts and to use the court system as an instrument of oppression, to delay, to undermine the declaration of an election result. Legions of opposition members took to the airwaves and social media to create false narratives. Mr. Speaker, that undermines the rule of law. The leaders must never, ever do that. Mr. Speaker, we all know that parliamentary oversight is essential. It is essential and it's a pillar of a democratic society. The government must account to the people. The taxpayers must have an explanation as to how their monies are being spent. Guyana has not done that for 640 days. We all knew that the absence of parliamentary oversight was because of the no confidence motion. But the remedy for the no confidence motion was an election within 3 months. We did not have to do that. That's what we did. We did not have to play games. When the government fell, there should have been an election within 3 months. The mere presentation of a budget by the Honorable Minister in this House is a monumental step to restoring the rule of law and democratic principles in this country, which has been under threat since December 2018. The mere presentation of a budget in this House represents the restoration of parliamentary oversight over government spending. The mere presentation of a budget in this House represents the restoration of constitutional mandates that all government spending must be approved in this House. The mere presentation of a budget in this House represents the democratic principles, and Guyana must be proud that this is being undertaken. Guyana must be proud that it is being undertaken in the record time with which it is. Mr. Speaker, as you well know, the preparation of a budget would usually exceed 120 days. This has been done in 5 weeks, Mr. Speaker. Now, having regard to the undeniable lack of progress, the undeniable lack of supervision, the undermining of the rule of law, perhaps the members on the opposition side would concede this debate. They had nothing at all. At least we have a budget.
Honorable member,
Beyond-
you will need an extension to conclude. Honorable member, you will need an extension to conclude.
May it please you, Mr. Speaker, could I respectfully ask for 5 minutes for the honorable member to conclude his debate speech?
Thank you very much. Honorable member, you may
Thank you.
proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honorable member, Mr. Trotman, mentioned this morning that Guyana has had recognized and positive growth by reports from the World Bank and the IMF. He didn't tell you of the debt that has been left behind. It is incorrect, Mr. Speaker, to equate what an economic indicator of growth is versus what a government financial health is. They are two different things. We are a petroleum producing country. They are different considerations. The private sector would be driven because they are interested in recovering that resource. Honorable Speaker, I just wish to raise a few things that this House, when they did not have supervision and when the rule of law was undermined, what took place. Global Witness, an international organization, has said that the coalition entered into arrangements, into a contract with ExxonMobil that will cost the Guyanese taxpayers approximately $55 billion. The report is available for anyone who wishes to read it online. That's about 1.3 billion United States dollars a year. That's 15 million Guyana dollars for every man, woman, and child. The honorable member, Mr. Trotman, rushed to execute that contract. We have heard all sorts of things about the why, but there are certain things that we must understand, and we must know what is in that contract and what the nation and what this government has to deal with. There is something in that contract at clause 32 called the stabilization clause. It says, if there is any change, if the government amends laws, different taxes, if there is any change, Exxon is entitled to a guarantee return, which means if they are to make less money, the government has got to make up the difference. These are not things that any person who is involved in the slightest way in the oil and gas sector would have in a contract any longer. It is no longer used. It is outmoded. In the same court you are. Now, that stabilization clause is what we have to deal with. Now, simple things we have heard for years about local content policy. Haven't done a bad deal for the government. The coalition would not do the decent thing for 5 years and have a local content policy that would help the citizens. There is still none. One is now being put in place. An advisory board is there. The budget states very clearly at page 59, we are going to implement it. It will be in accordance with the Santiago principles. It will be so that there would be no non-disclosure of any transaction. There will be involvement from civil society. These are the things that must be done if Guyana and the nation is to benefit. Mr. Speaker, finally, I only wish to raise one simple but effective anecdote that has been told to me by my old lecturer. In a petroleum country like Guyana, where we are a blank slate, we have to put legislation, we have to put regulations and all of it in place, and we have to build the capacity to negotiate. It's like making bread. And if we are to make bread, the ingredients have to be good enough. We need to do that. We need to have the proper equipment for the baking of the bread. We also need the people to monitor the bread so that it doesn't burn. The most important part of the bread is the people, the flour. But I dare say, if the honorable member, Mr. Trotman, if his mother, his dear mother, God rest her soul, had sent him for bread like that, and he had brought back what he brought back to the Guyanese people, he would have got licks. So we cannot be saddled by things that the coalition ignored. Maybe they didn't know, maybe they didn't care, maybe they deliberately did it. It was incompetence, Mr. Speaker, and we could see at page 59 of the budget speech that we are addressing it. Support for creation, building capacity, social and economic infrastructure. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very, very much, Honorable Member, Mr. Dattin. We now welcome for her maiden presentation, Ms. Amanza Walton Desir. Honorable Member, Ms. Walton Desir. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as you have so eloquently put, I'm about to embark on my maiden speech to this honorable House. And Mr. Speaker, I had my points for speaking well documented and jotted down, but I am afraid I am suffering from some alarm, Mr. Speaker, because I think I heard the Honorable Mr. Dattin admit to the weaponization of the Caribbean Court of Justice. Was that what we heard? As an attorney at law, Mr. Speaker, that is cause for alarm. And I think that is cause for concern to the entire Guyanese public. Nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, I wish to thank you. And it is with a profound sense of humility that I arise to address this honorable House for the first time. I wish to place on record, Mr. Speaker, my appreciation to the APNU-AFC coalition and our supporters for their confidence in me. Mr. Speaker, I am mindful of the oath that I took standing here some days ago, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the people of Guyana, Mr. Speaker, the people of Guyana, and that I will represent their interests without fear, Mr. Speaker. True faith and allegiance, and I will do so without ill will. Mr. Speaker, before I come to my thoughts on what has been presented to us as Budget 2020, I wish to say, Mr. Speaker, that love of country and service to country are values that were instilled in me as a little girl growing up on the Quarantine Coast and then in Linden. It is this love of country, Mr. Speaker, that has seen me throughout my professional career in service to the people of Guyana across various portfolios and across various administrations. And this was so up until a few weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, when I was told by the current administration that my services were no longer required.
Mr. Speaker, at this juncture, I cannot help but note with amusement the Honorable Member Indar referencing the fact that the GCAA is staffed by comebackies and returnees. Well, I am neither a comebacky nor a returnee, Mr. Speaker. I have stayed here and I have worked in service to the people of Guyana. What would be even more amusing if it were not that the Honorable Minister has recently appointed a comebacky as his advisor to aviation. And so, Mr. Speaker, we see through those empty platitudes and complaints. Mr. Speaker, I wish to say that as a Guyanese, notwithstanding being relieved of my post, I am first a Guyanese. And I am fortified, Mr. Speaker, in the words of the scripture. Thank you, Mr. Darmla. I am fortified, Mr. Speaker, by the words of the Bible that says that all things work together for good. And I believe that this has worked for my good, Mr. Speaker, as I am now in a position to be of greater service to the people of Guyana. And I wish to say, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, the government of Guyana is poorer for its decision. Mr. Speaker, as I turn my attention to what has been presented to us as the 2020 budget, it is not lost on me, and I will enjoin us to not lose sight of the fact that this budget is being presented in a particular context. Two very important contexts, Mr. Speaker. One, the COVID-19 pandemic, and secondly, Mr. Speaker, the ever-deteriorating state of law and order in our country that we've seen over the last 40 days and 40 nights. Mr. Speaker, I wish to record my alarm and my grave concern at the rapid deterioration of law and order that we have seen. And I'm so very happy that the speaker that preceded me spoke so emphatically on the importance of law and order. We have been plunged, Mr. Speaker, over the last few weeks into the depths of ethnic strife, reminiscent of our descent into those dark days of the 1960s, which are recorded in the annals of our history. Mr. Speaker, I will say that it is my view as a Guyanese, Mr. Speaker, that the blame for this current state of affairs must be placed squarely at the feet of those who, in their thirst for political power, unabashedly, Mr. Speaker, fan the flames of racism and intolerance in our country, or those whom in their silence, Mr. Speaker, were complicit. Over the last 40 days, sir, we have seen the constitutional rights of Guyanese trampled upon. We have seen the orders of our courts violated by those who took an oath to protect and serve. And yet, Mr. Speaker, I am sure that it is not lost upon us that when we sit quietly in our homes and in our thoughts, and that as history has shown us time and time again, that the day of reckoning will come. The day of reckoning always comes, Mr. Speaker. But again, Mr. Speaker, and at the risk of being accused of exhorting a sermon by my colleagues on the opposite side of the House, I want to admonish us that they that sow the wind reap the whirlwind. And as the speaker preceding me referenced flour in what can only be seen as a very crass remark, given the fact that my colleague would have just lost his mother. The stalk has no head. It will produce no flour. Were it to yield grain, foreigners would swallow it up. Those are actually the words of the Bible. Those are actually the words of the Bible, Honorable Member Hamilton. And so, Mr. Speaker, it admonishes us that were it to bear fruit, foreigners would swallow it up. And as I'm speaking about foreigners, Mr. Speaker, I want to register my disappointment at the failure of the 2020 budget to set out a coherent and comprehensive vision for Guyana's foreign policy. Mr. Speaker, the framing of foreign policy is indispensable for the modern state. This is even more the case for a small developing state such as ours. And our foreign policy here in Guyana must perform the delicate balance of balancing the national interests whilst acknowledging our interdependence in an ever-contracting global village. National development, Mr. Speaker, takes place within the context of foreign policy. In this regard, Mr. Speaker, one would have expected that the current government would seize the earliest opportunity to clarify its foreign policy position to the people of Guyana. And clarify they must, Mr. Speaker, if for no other reason, sir, than the fact that we have witnessed in our very recent past unprecedented levels of interference by foreign powers in our last national and regional elections. The obviously biased, Mr. Speaker, and at times downright disrespectful utterances have not gone unnoticed by Guyanese. But far more disturbing, Mr. Speaker, far more disturbing is the silence of these same foreign powers over the last few tumultuous weeks in our existence. And as most right-thinking Guyanese, Mr. Speaker, I am forced to ask, I am forced to wonder whether this is the desired state of affairs for our beloved nation. Mr. Speaker, it is to be recalled that it was the David Granger-led administration which advanced the matter of the resolution of the Guyana-Venezuela dispute, the farthest it has ever reached on the road to a final settlement at the International Criminal Court of Justice. And in this regard, Mr. Speaker, we welcome the commitment to a bipartisan approach to this matter. We are also pleased, Mr. Speaker, to see the current administration express its interest in protecting Guyana's sovereignty. But were I a prognosticator, Mr. Speaker, I would venture to say that given recent developments, this commitment is one that will be severely tested in the coming months. As a citizen of Guyana, Mr. Speaker, the recent foreign policy actions by the PPPC-led administration is cause for grave concern. From its departure from the time-honored international conventions, as evidenced by Guyana's support of the U.S. candidate for the presidency to the IDB, to the fear of our citizenry that Guyana is about to be inserted front and center, Mr. Speaker, in U.S. geopolitical engagements. Mr. Speaker, our people deserve answers. We are expecting, sir, the highest ranking U.S. official to visit our soil. But this visit, Mr. Speaker, seems to be shrouded in secrecy. In secrecy, Mr. Speaker, the people of Guyana have no agenda, have no idea what the agenda for this meeting is. The people of Guyana we have no idea as to what this visit will cost taxpayers. Mr. Speaker, it begs the question, why is this visit shrouded in such secrecy? Mr. Speaker, we want to admonish that as a small developing nation, we have to ensure that we do not become entangled in the geopolitical interventions that can be detrimental to the people of Guyana. Mr. Speaker, the people of Guyana deserve answers. What is it that we agreed to? What is it that was promised? And how does any action on our part have deleterious consequences on our case currently before the International Criminal Court of Justice? Mr. Speaker, we deserve answers. We fear that we are beginning to witness, Mr. Speaker, a departure from the consistency in position taken at the United Nations by the AP and UAFC government, and a return to the very erratic, Mr. Speaker, voting patterns which characterize our pre-2015 international engagements. Mr. Speaker, Guyana has gained much by establishing itself as a reliable partner in regional and hemispheric stability. It would be unwise, Mr. Speaker, for us to depart from this form of diplomacy. Mr. Speaker, the strengthening of Guyana's multilateral diplomacy and the improvement of the regional and hemispheric international presence depends not only on sound policy, but also on the caliber of our foreign service personnel. It is our view, Mr. Speaker, that the study of our international relations and the understanding of our national interests and the practice of our diplomacy should not be left to chance. Our foreign service personnel are on the forefront of the actualization of our foreign policy. And it was with this in mind, Mr. Speaker, that the AP and UAFC coalition government re-engineered and re-established the Foreign Services Institute, which was for all intents and purposes, sir, put on hold and allowed to fossilize, under the PPPC administration. The aim is to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that Guyana is equipped with a corps of edified and competent, sir, diplomats. Mr. Speaker, we are proud of the fact that we have been able to assemble a multi-ethnic cadre of ambassadors, truly reflective, sir, of our multi-ethnic makeup. Mr. Speaker, we remember with alarm some years ago hearing a senior functionary of the PPPC say under oath that there were no Afro-Guyanese qualified to be ambassadors. Mr. Speaker, they were proven wrong. And so all of Guyana now waits with bated breath to see what our ambassadorial appointments will look like. Mr. Speaker,
Honorable
the tenure
member,
of the
before you
AP and
continue,
UAFC
Honorable
government
member.
was characterized by a steady.
Honorable member, before you continue, you will need an extension to conclude.
Comrade Speaker, I do ask for 5 minutes for the honorable member to conclude our presentation.
Thank you, honorable member. Honorable member, you can continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, our approach to foreign policy has been steady and studied. And for the record, sir, I wish to record, time is now against me, and so I cannot be exhaustive, some of the accomplishments as it relates to the foreign relations. Mr. Speaker, it was the AP and UAFC government that identified Guyana's chairmanship of the Group of 77 in China as a strategic priority, and which has resulted in Guyana's ascension to the chairmanship of the G77 in January of this year. Mr. Speaker, it is the AP and UAFC-led administration that established as a discrete unit within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Bilateral Affairs Department, and which has over the last few years, sir, concluded a number of bilateral agreements, including for the establishment of diplomatic missions in the United Arab Emirates and Ghana. Mr. Speaker, cognizant of our ever-increasing prominence on the international stage and being committed to the promotion of international law and order, the AP and UAFC over the course of its 5 years in office would have ratified or acceded to over 25 multilateral treaties in the important areas of environmental justice, the protection of children, the protection of the marine environment, and international shipping. And as I'm on the topic of the marine environment and international shipping, Mr. Speaker, I must say that given the anticipated growth in maritime traffic as a result of increased offshore activities, we would have hoped to see in this budget, sir, some emphasis being placed on strategic planning within the maritime sector. Mr. Speaker, we wish to strongly recommend that maritime spatial planning be given urgent priority in the immediate term, as there is need for a cross-cutting policy tool which will enable a strategic and integrated approach to the management of our maritime space. We wish to strongly urge, Mr. Speaker, the commissioning of a national maritime and port sector master plan. Such a plan will serve to strengthen the internal competitiveness of the maritime and port sectors. I hope that the Honorable Bishop Edgell is taking note. Mr. Speaker, under the AP and UFC coalition government, the aviation sector soared to new heights. Guyana, as a state party to the Chicago Convention, has achieved record compliance with the requirements of the Treaty on the Convention, on civil aviation. Guyana's level of effective implementation, sir, in 2015 stood at a mere 44%. Today, we are at 74.4%, far above the global average of 60%. And I would venture to say, Mr. Speaker, that this should address the honorable member, the minister within the Ministry of Public Works, as it relates to expenditure, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, such a level of effective implementation could never be achieved unless one hired competent personnel, sir, and spent money on improving the aviation and air services infrastructure in Guyana. Mr. Speaker, this accomplishment has earned Guyana the ICAO Council President certificate for being one of the 10 most progressive states in aviation. Mr. Speaker, if there ever were a sector that is ripe for a bipartisan approach, it is the civil aviation sector. I know of no person here who, when he gets on a plane, say if he is of nefarious intent, Mr. Speaker, who is not interested in arriving safely to his destination. We therefore need at all times, Mr. Speaker, the best people for the job. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I want to note the stellar achievement, another stellar achievement, the commissioning of a civil aviation master plan that has provided Guyana, sir, with a 20-year strategic plan for the seamless development of the civil aviation sector. Finally, in closing, sir, I wish to say that as a new entrant into the field of politics, I chose to mount the platform of the AP and UFC coalition because I believed then that it represented Guyana's most positive steps towards an inclusionary democracy. I am now sure, Mr. Speaker, that I made the right choice. Very sure, Mr. Speaker, that I made the right choice. Mr. Speaker, I will say the time for pettiness, the time for winner-takes-all, the winner-takes-all paradigm that has come to characterize our politics, is the time for that, sir, is over. Mr. Speaker, the time for race-based politics in Guyana is over. The people of Guyana deserve better, Mr. Speaker. I wish to say that Isaiah Henry deserved better, Mr. Speaker. I wish to say that Joel Henry deserved better, sir. And certainly Mr. Harris Singh deserved better. And so today, sir, I add my voice to the clarion call for justice for our sons. May their senseless deaths, sir, ever serve as a memorial to our failure, sir. One that reminds us every day, one that demands of us every day, sir, that we forge a better Guyana. Mr. Speaker, we can and we must. I thank you, sir.
Thank you very, very much, Honorable Member. Just a notice to the Committee of Selection. At the suspension, we will be meeting in the Dome to carry on the meeting of the Committee of Selection to deal with some urgent business. I now call on the Honorable Member, Mr. Alistair Charlie. Honorable Member, Mr. Charlie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I bring greetings to this honorable House from the people of Region 9, Upper Takatu, Upper Essequibo. From my Makushi brothers and sisters, Myanmar. From my Wapishana brothers and sisters, Kaimen. And from my YY brothers and sisters, Kirwahi. Mr. Speaker, I have listened attentively to the contribution to this budget debate. And I have noted some remarks made by the opposition members. Mr. Speaker, the opposition members in this parliament tend to forget where they were, where they have failed. Thus, they forget that this government, when in opposition, reminded them that they were failing the Guyanese people. They were standing on sinking sand. Thus, they are now occupying the opposition benches because you have tremendously failed the Guyanese people. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Raphael Trotman alluded to the budget earlier this morning. It is not a cohesive budget. Mr. Speaker, I ask the Honorable Member to read
Mr. Speaker,
this budget.
I stand on a point of order. My colleagues in the opposition here are conducting themselves in a manner that undermines the identity of the indigenous peoples of Guyana.
Honorable Member, for the record, you should state the point of order, which section of the standing orders that is being violated. I don't consider that a point of order. Honorable Member, Mr. Charlie, please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that is the attitude of those agents over there. Disrespect to the Amerindians. 5 years. The Amerindians were disrespected, and later in my presentation, I will tell you how we were disrespected. Back to the Honorable Minister Trotman. I urge the Honorable Member to read and understand this budget presentation. And you will see that this budget is cohesive. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Member from Region, the representative from Region 2, alluded to the Kumu Hydro Project. The Honorable Member needs to go to Region 9 and see if that hydro project is in operation. Mr. Speaker, I stand here to set the record straight that no such project was implemented under the APNU-AFC coalition government. The people of Region 9 was promised an airdrome at Lethem Airstrip. I asked the honorable members over there, where is the project? Mr. Speaker, it's misleading when opposition members try to paint a picture that everything was bright and beautiful under their tenure in the Amerindian communities. But at the level of the village, it was a different reality. Mr. Speaker, an honorable member alluded to court. Mr. Speaker, the PPP will only go to the court when its citizens' rights are threatened. We will not waste our time and go to the court to prove 32 is more than 33. We will not do that. We stand resolute with the people of Guyana, and we are in government to protect their rights. Mr. Speaker, I, like my honorable colleagues on this side of the House who spoke before me, rise to make my contribution to this budget debate. But firstly, I want to extend my congratulations to the Honorable Minister, Bishop Gwan Edgehill, for presenting this budget that is inclusive and equitable. Mr. Speaker, appreciation is also in order for the staff of the Ministry of Finance who had worked to make this budget ready in a relatively short time frame. Mr. Speaker, before I touch on the impact of Budget 2020 on hinterland communities, please allow me to digress a little. Mr. Speaker, a national newspaper of October 1, 2019, which was then working as one of the propaganda arms of the coalition regime, was spreading wrong information under the caption, "Napi residents overjoyed about first-time water access in hopes." Mr. Speaker, under the PPPC administration before the questionable coalition win at the polls in 2015, the water sector had experienced unprecedented progress and development, as focus had been placed on ensuring residents across the region, including Napi Village in Region 9, have access to safe drinking water. Residents across the region had access to potable water in their homes as a consequence of the PPPC's government investments in strategies and methodologies, including but not limited to solar water systems, drill wells, stressors, and gravity feed systems. Mr. Speaker, the PPPC government during its tenure had evidently transformed the Amerindian communities, and it's a fact, Mr. Speaker, and it is an incontrovertible fact that Amerindian development became a prioritized reality under the PPPC administration through specially designed hinterland programs. And again, Mr. Speaker, the PPPC government will continue on the progressive and development route. Budget 2020, Mr. Speaker, caters for numerous socio-economic initiatives towards the implementation in all hinterland communities, all with the intention and aim of bringing hinterland development in conjunction to the coastal development without sacrificing traditional morals and customs, thus ushering, Mr. Speaker, in qualitative changes for the well-being of all Amerindians across this country. Mr. Speaker, primarily the ultimate goal of these development projects in Budget 2020 will make the hinterland communities self-sufficient. And once again, Mr. Speaker, with self-administration under the Village Council facilitated under the umbrella of the first ever Amerindian Affairs Ministry, brought into being under the Jagan-led government of October 5th, 1992. Mr. Speaker, we shall not forget that it was then President Cherry Jagan who designated September as Amerindian Heritage Month and honored the first Guyanese Amerindian Member of Parliament, Stephen Campbell, by naming September 10th Amerindian Heritage Day. Mr. Speaker, I now turn my attention to the presidential grant. Mr. Speaker, Budget 2020 caters for the necessary funds for the presidential grant, which will significantly impact Amerindian communities. The presidential grant will allow many Amerindian villages to implement empowerment and development projects. Land titling and demarcation. The implementation of the US $10.7 million the coalition government had inherited in 2015 for the land titling project should have provided, Mr. Speaker, absolute grants and certificates of title to Amerindian communities. This program in 2013 had targeted Amerindian villages, and the process would have completed by the end of 2016. But, Mr. Speaker, it came to an abrupt halt under the coalition administration. Mr. Speaker, the PPPC government under the Ministry of Amerindian Affairs, under the competent minister, Honorable Pauline Sukai, will fix it and deliver the needs of Guyana's first people. Mr. Speaker, hinterland electrification program. Hinterland communities will be provided with electricity through the hinterland electrification program. Hinterland and coastal riverine communities will benefit once again from this under the PPPC government. Mr. Speaker, education opportunities. Amerindian communities will once again, under the PPPC government, be provided with the necessary infrastructure which will enable them to receive the quality of education for their development and attainment to higher education and skills development. In tertiary education and further fields. Mr. Speaker, spread across the hinterland region are approximately 250 schools, and all will benefit. Inclusive, Mr. Speaker, of Anai Secondary School, Aishalton Secondary School, Sand Creek Secondary School, all in Region 9, St. Ignatius Secondary School, Paramakatay Primary School, and the Cato Primary School in Region 8, and not forgetting Waramadong Secondary School in Region 7. Mr. Speaker, through the intervention of Budget 2020, secondary and primary education will be easily accessible as it caters for hinterland students from all remote areas as well. And this will be made possible.
2 minutes without an extension.
Mr. Speaker.
Go ahead. 2 minutes without an extension.
Mr. Speaker, social assistance. Budget 2020 caters for the National School Uniform Program, and it will aid thousands of Amerindian students. The program will positively impact students' school attendance and performance. Each student in the hinterland school will once again benefit from the PPPC government because we care initiative as a further incentive to ensure Guyana's children attend school. Mr. Speaker, Hinterland Scholarship, Budget 2020 caters for the Hinterland Scholarship Program, and it will provide academic facilitation for the furtherance of studies both at the secondary and tertiary level for all hinterland students. Mr. Speaker, transportation boost. Amerindian communities will once again benefit from the PPPC government from transportation assistance in the form of tractors or carrying vehicles, boats and engines, and pickups to aid in community projects. Transportation, Mr. Speaker, students will benefit to go to school, also emergencies, and among others. Mr. Speaker, road infrastructure. In order to create greater linkages between Amerindian communities and improve access to goods and services, Budget 2020 caters for sums to construct new roads and maintenance of existing ones that the coalition government neglected for 5 years. Mr. Speaker, health services. Budget 2020 will ensure Amerindians receive much needed health care. Mr. Speaker, this sector was a neglect under the coalition government, but however, the residents of the hinterland can rest assured that health services are one of the PPPC's priorities. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can someone move an extension for the honorable member to conclude?
Asking kindly for 5 minutes for the honorable member to conclude his speech.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Honorable member, you may continue to conclude.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can go on and on to mention the numerous achievements, progress, and development initiatives that will take place across the hinterland regions under the PPPC administration. Prior to elections 2020, it was evident that the coalition parties using state funds were traversing across the hinterland, distributing handouts and trying to bribe residents, using state resources in their bid for the Amerindians and hinterland residents to give them another chance at the just concluded elections. Mr. Speaker, fool us once, shame on the coalition parties. Fool us twice, shame on us. But despite their best efforts, they could not fool Guyana's first people a second time. We collectively voted for peace, progress, and prosperity. The PPPC, under the wise and caring leadership of our President, Dr. Irfan Ali, our Vice President, Dr. Bharat Jagdeo, and our Prime Minister, Brigadier Mark Phillips. Mr. Speaker, Guyana's history is replete with stories of PNC-led electoral violence. Mr. Speaker, we have seen 5 months of political unrest in our country. And this was caused by the coalition themselves, the coalition parties themselves. Mr. Speaker, Amerindians will never forget that the coalition government established a commission of inquiry to investigate their lands concretizing their narratives of Amerindians not being the first people to Guyana in attempt to usurp Amerindian people's land, and also labeling Amerindians as greedy, and we should not benefit from the oil and gas sector, for which this coalition government over there, the opposition now, never apologized to the Amerindian nation. Mr. Speaker, it's a fact. We, Guyana's first people, laud the budget 2020 team, protecting our people in a COVID-19 environment, strengthening democracy and the rule of law, incentivizing growth and job creation, enhancing welfare, which speaks volumes of competent and caring government from all walks of life, can now breathe a sigh of relief since this budget addresses a plan for inexorable climb to the attainment of prosperity for all who strive to achieve. Mr. Speaker, Budget 2020 will strengthen the Guyanese people's social compact and fulfill the promises of equal opportunities for all to prosper. Budget 2020 will transform our country's economy, particularly in the Amerindian and hinterland communities, since the PPPC government, through this budget, will strengthen our social demographics by ensuring all benefit from the fruits accrued through the prudent and caring leadership of the progressive and astute administration construct. Mr. Speaker, no one can say that this budget is not a people's budget. And my presentation this afternoon proved to all that this budget is inclusive. This budget is equitable. It is a people's budget. Mr. Speaker, no one in this budget is left behind. Everyone has a bite of the pie in the 2020 budget. Even you over there, your supporters over there will benefit from 2020 budget. So speak to the budget as benefiting everyone in Guyana. Mr. Speaker, inclusive and equitable. And this is what the PPPC government is all about. It is what we believe in, regardless of one's political affiliation, regardless of race, religion, gender. Mr. Speaker, this is what the PPPC is about. And I ask the honorable members over there to come and join us as we move our country forward as one people, one nation, with one destiny. Mr. Speaker, I ask the opposition members to support this budget. You have your constituents. You have a constituency. Let their benefit. Don't deny them, because 2020 budget is a budget for everyone. It's a budget, a plan for prosperity. With this, Mr. Speaker, I ask that the budget be supported and we move the development process from here. Our people need us. Our country needs us. You have wounded our country. It's time to rebuild what you have broken. Mr. Speaker, as I take my leave, I ask...
But you have to take it now because you're now 2 minutes in excess of the 5 minutes.
That the passage of this budget be endorsed by everyone. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We have the Honorable Vincent Henry to take the floor next. I want to allow Mr. Henry to continue past 4 o'clock so that he can conclude it. So let us allow Mr. Henry to conclude his maiden presentation in the National Assembly beyond the time for the suspension. The Honorable Member, Mr. Henry.
Thank you very much,
You can make your contribution.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Guyana Action Party, a member of the APNU AOC coalition, and the people of the hinterland, I do express sincerest condolences to the families of the boys who were brutally murdered on the East Coast and demand, on the West Coast, and demand that justice be served. Mr. Speaker, one favorite slogan that all Guyanese heard recently was, "Forwards ever, backwards never." Having examined the budget presented by the Honorable Juan Edgel, I have come to the conclusion that this budget before us can only be called a backwards budget, especially as it relates to the indigenous people's affairs. Mr. Speaker, we are currently celebrating a virtual Indigenous Peoples Heritage Month of activities. It is, however, noted that the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples Affairs seems to have run out of ideas or is now under some sort of iron curtain where ideas are not encouraged to flow. The program posted by this ministry is lackluster and devoid of innovation. Mr. Speaker, this year's heritage activities could have included virtual storytelling, poetry writing and reading, solo singing competitions, among many others. We could have also used this opportunity to give recognition and substantial awards to outstanding Indigenous persons in various sectors of life, such as the foremost balata figurine maker in Guyana and the world, Mr. George Tamfield. The father of community-based tourism in the world, Mr. Sidney Alicott. Our cultural icon, Mrs. Dorothy Faria. Former Member of Parliament, Honorable Philip Duncan, and many others. Mr. Speaker, in this instance, we have to ask the current Minister of Indigenous Peoples Affairs to become inclusive. Do not lock the door on other Guyanese who have a contribution to give for the development of this country and the indigenous peoples. There is nothing to be gained by keeping others away because you perceive them to be opposition people. Take a leaf from Minister Adikok and let us work towards a celebratory but meaningful Heritage Month of activities for the rest of the month and future years to come. Mr. Speaker, our history dictates that we remember the Honorable Stephen Campbell, our first indigenous person who became a parliamentarian in Guyana on the 10th of September, 1957. This honorable gentleman is remembered for his struggles to ensure that the indigenous peoples of Guyana gain land tenure via land titles and demarcations. It is unfortunate that he died before he could have seen a major milestone of his work being achieved when at independence in 1966, Guyana and Great Britain agreed that we would be granted what we fought for. On behalf of the indigenous peoples, the first peoples of Guyana, I call on the relevant authorities, including the government of this country, Guyana, to begin and guide the process to facilitate the granting of the 10th of September as a national holiday. No, are you clapping? Aren't we supporting the indigenous people? What about the opposition? Shame on you. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, I shouldn't go so far. Mr. Speaker, we have seen the remaining of the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples Affairs to Ministry of Amerindian Affairs. One wonders if this was done because of sheer ignorance. I say this because if one should examine the word Amerindian or name Amerindian, it clearly shows that it is made up of two parts, Amar plus Indian. The first part, Amar, A-M-E-R, has its genesis from an Italian explorer by the name of Amerigo Vespucci, who between 1497 to 1505 made trips to what is now known as North America. From his name, Amerigo, the continents are known as North and South America. However, Mr. Speaker, this explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, was known to have pillaged indigenous settlements and killed the people using his superior weapons. He was said to have captured over 200 indigenous people and forcibly took them to Spain as slaves. After him, many more invaders came, and tens of millions of our ancestors were decimated by massacres or by diseases brought by the invaders. Mr. Speaker, all of these atrocities are associated with Amar, A-M-E-R, part of the word Amerindian. Mr. Speaker, the other part of the name Indian came about because of mistaken identity. Christopher Columbus in 1492 arrived in the Bahamas and thought he had reached the East Indies while traveling across the ocean. So he mistakenly called our ancestors, whom he found here, Indians. Mr. Speaker, for the ministry that represents the indigenous peoples of Guyana to be named the Ministry of Amerindian Affairs is to not only insult our intelligence, but is also to say that it does not matter that our ancestors were decimated like unwanted animals, and it does not matter that a mistaken identity was pushed down our throats, and even more so, it would not matter if these atrocities were to be repeated on us today and to our future generations. What a shame to go back into that part of our history and call us by that name. Mr. Speaker, this budget sees the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples Affairs making a decision to quote, unquote, rehire the 2,000 CSOs who were supposedly fired. Mr. Speaker, in the first place, the CSOs were never fired by APNU AFC government. When Minister Adcock took office in 2015, his team found a check that was cancelled by the PPPC government. This check was to pay the CSOs for the month of April 2015, prior to the election. It was the PPPC who cancelled the check. It was the PPPC who fired the 2,000 CSOs. Shame on you! And yet you can go on TV and keep repeating that fallacy. I don't want to say lie. I don't want to say lie. Repeating it, saying all the time, like the German psychologist or whatever you call him, saying that a lie over and over to make it sound and become true.
Honorable member, lie is a word that we don't use in the National Assembly.
Pardon me?
Lie is a word which we do not use in the National Assembly.
I will humbly retract.
Please continue.
Mr. Adcock and his team then had to lobby and find funds to pay the CSOs their last payments. After an assessment, the APNU AFC government launched the Hinterland Youth Entrepreneurial Program, or HAZE. Thereby, the youth of the hinterland communities continued to get the 30,000 per month. It wasn't stopped. However, the APNU AFC HAZE program had positive, sustainable benefits for both the youths who were trained and the indigenous communities at large. The PPPC's CSO program was very limited in scope. It gave each youth on the program a sum of 30,000 per month. The youths on that CSO program had no supervision. There was no monitoring, no evaluation. There was no training in any way. Every now and then, some of the CSOs, all decked in red and T-shirts, were taken somewhere to picket against the then APNU AFC opposition. Imagine they went to picket the opposition. Mr. Speaker, to date, approximately 4,000 indigenous youths were trained under the APNU AFC PACE program. In this program, our youth not only received the $30,000 per month, but received training in entrepreneurship, maths and English, tourism, agriculture, leadership, public speaking, and many more skills. Mr. Speaker, there are some who are quick to parrot anything that the PPP government says. I have read that one indigenous leader who says he is in opposition, but really a full-out PPP strongman, parroting that the Hayes program was a failure. Mr. Speaker, allow me to give a few examples of what our youth have done and are still doing because of the Hayes program. There are many successful projects owned by young men and their wives who are trained under the Hayes program. For example, in Park Corner Village, these include several swine farms, corn and peas farms, thriving groceries, selling of petrol, etc., etc.